So Franklin does this about-face, which supporters of the Missionary Society were quite happy to then point to all of his comments beforehand in support of the Missionary Society. And so they reprinted some of those in their own papers saying, oh, well, Franklin used to say this.
This is Ben Franklin, right? But not just Ben.
What was that?
This is Ben Franklin.
Yeah, not the founding father Benjamin Franklin, but yes, he's dead at this point. Yes. So there you have this separation. Now, there were some supporters of the Missionary Society who said that yes, the Missionary Society had done some inappropriate things by passing those resolutions during the war. But that did not change the usefulness of the society. Right? So you kind of have like three groups kind of here. You have the Southerners, the conservatives, who are saying, you know, the Missionary Society is not a scriptural organization. You have the Northerners who were very unionist during the Civil War, who are saying, hey, if it was good enough before the Civil War, it should be good enough after the Civil War. And then you have this group of moderates who are supportive of the society, but they also recognize that there were some things that were done that were inappropriate, but that didn't change that the society was still good. So, last thing to say about this was the argument from silence. So the argument from silence essentially was, since Scripture didn't authorize missionary societies, that they were condemned. Well, when critics of the society started using that as a reason against the societies, some, including Campbell's son-in-law, who by this time was the editor of the Millennial Harbinger, because Campbell had passed away in 1866, reminded people that when Thomas Campbell said, where Scripture speaks, we speak, where Scripture is silent, we are silent, he was saying that at the start of the Christian Association of Washington, which was one of these, essentially, non-congregational societies. It was kind of like the Missionary Society, right? So when he said, where Scripture speaks, we speak, where Scriptures are silent, we are silent, he was saying it in support of this type of missionary society. So here you are arguing against silence, but that very foundational principle was set in the context of the support of a missionary type of society. So that obviously that's not swaying people more than that, right? If you're already convinced it's wrong, you're going your way. If you're already convinced it's right, you're going your way. And so that too was leading to this division. Any last questions or comments about division? We'll definitely pick it up on the other side in the 20th century here in a couple of classes.
Okay. I was just going to ask you, under the missionary society, you said that they were becoming more like a denominational structure rather than I missed that.
Rather than some sort of just type of cooperative society, okay, where people could kind of work together. It was moving more towards like a denominational board type of system. All right, let's move on into talking about something that's been hanging on here a while, as we've kind of left it as a tangential issue, but some of the things dealing with race in the Restoration movement and thinking about how that is working with some of these other things that we've been looking at. So race has been an important part of how people have been looking at the Civil War and ended up shaping this union. I want to look at it more here from the African American experience here in the development of this group. Prior to the Civil War, there are early records of African Americans in congregations from the 1820s. There could be certainly people joined the movement before that, but there's definite records that can show that by the 1820s, the Cane Ridge congregation, which has grown out of the Cane Ridge Revival, the Cane Ridge Church, and the Brush Run Church, which is what happened out of the Christian Association, right? The Christian Association of Washington becomes the Brush Run Church. Both of those had African American members in the 1820s. There were congregations, African American congregations in Kentucky and Virginia early on. The first African American congregation appears to be in Kentucky in 1834. There were others in Ohio, and North Carolina, Tennessee, that followed within the next 20 years or so. Essentially, as we see African Americans becoming a part of the movement, there are two different ways in which they were a part of the movement. One way was through integrated churches, integrated congregations. Often in those cases, there was a very limited role for African Americans. So they could serve as exhorters, or we may call preachers, to African Americans. And so it wasn't that they were given the opportunity to preach to anyone, but they were ordained to preach to other African Americans. There were some black deacons. Often, again, their role was to address and to serve African Americans. It wasn't a general role. And then, of course, there were a variety of maintenance type of roles, service type of roles that blacks were allowed in as well. And those integrated congregations, north and south, right? So they're congregations that are integrated in both places.
So north, they only preached to African American audiences too.
Yeah, it was still the same kind of thing. Yeah, and there were still a lot of limits.
So there really was no distinctions across the regions with that.
Not really. Not with that. So one expression, of course, were these integrated or mixed-race congregations. Then the other one was, of course, separate congregations that were specifically made up of just African American members. There, you found black elders, board members of African Americans taking leadership roles. And here's one place where there was some distinction. In the free states, those black churches were allowed their autonomy. Right? So there was a separate congregation with its own separate leadership. In the South, often those congregations had a mother church, so to speak, that was kind of expected to be overseeing that congregation. And that wasn't just within the Restoration, but similar types of things happened in other religious groups as well. Also very early on, you see a lot of interest in, both North and South, in the education of African Americans, particularly religious education. Thomas Campbell, Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone, Walter Scott, Benjamin Franklin, all held opportunities for schooling courses for African Americans. With that, the trend in the early 19th century, of course, we talked about that very emotional expression of religion and how a lot of Restorationist leaders tended to be more focused on reason and rationality. And the same kind of thing was true even in their education practices, trying to influence the reason, as well as with African Americans. But there were a lot of, at the very least, racialist notions, if not outright racist notions. And so it was kind of like, well, African Americans tend to be, they would have used other terms, tend to be more emotional, but we're teaching them rationally, which of course is fallacious, but I mean that's a lot of the notions at the time. And so when a lot of African Americans left Restoration Movement churches after the Civil War, the assumption was that, you know, that African Americans wanted something more emotional than necessarily rational. And so according to some white leaders, blacks were irresponsible, superstitious, these are their terms, interested only in emotionalism. And so the idea was, you know, that's why not too many African Americans joined the movement. I don't think that had anything to do with it per se. You know, I mean, maybe there was some, you know, some aspect of that, but I don't think that was a large part of it. After the Civil War, you do see a steep decline in the numbers of the African Americans in the movement. Most of those who joined, especially in the South, tended to be slaves. Many of those held in slavery by members of the movement. And so because the master goes to one of these restorationist churches, that's where the slaves ended up going. Sometimes a slave preacher would be freed by whites who purchased them in order to allow them to focus on preaching to slaves. And so around 1850, it was estimated that there were 101,000 African Americans in the Restoration movement. 101,000.
101,000.
1850 and 100.
1850 and 101,000. After the Civil War, it was estimated that that number plummeted to 7,000. So it was 101,000. So 6 figures down to 4. It could be a variety of reasons for that. One of which could be, now that you were free, you weren't expected to, or you weren't forced to go to this congregation that your master was going to. So that might have been part of it. It could have been that, you know, other groups were better at addressing the needs of African Americans post-Civil War. Right? So there are a couple reasons why that was a decline, but it was a really, really sharp decline. But it gradually started moving back up. By 1861, there were about 5,500 mixed congregations, about 1,500 separate congregations. Again, that number plummeted as well. But gradually, new congregations started to be developing. Often, a lot of the new congregations were, the mixed congregations were still controlled by whites, and there seems to have been a general encouragement that blacks should start their own congregations. So there's more of this separatist impulse. But there were mixed congregations in places like Kansas, Kentucky, Mississippi. You don't have to get all these down, so just rattle them all over again. Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, right? So all over the places. Separate congregations in Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, Ohio, Tennessee. Right? So, you know, kind of broad representation.
They actually had this congregation in Mississippi.
They did.
That's surprising.
Yeah, well, I mean,
During that time.
yeah, you know, the kind of there's that holdover from the pre-Civil War when the slaves would be forced to go.
Now, one thing, the Reconstruction period, that probably also factored in with these, the immigration, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, and so that had an effect as well. But it seems like the trend toward, you know, as Reconstruction happened and the post-Civil War period, it was more of a trend, even in the North, kind of moved toward a separate, right, white church, black church.
Like during the Reconstruction?
Yeah.
Okay. But now, during the Reconstruction, when you say that's probably was the most integrated time, like post-Civil War, before the 20th century?
You know, yeah, I would say it was probably actually even more integrated prior to the Civil War. Yeah. And I think it was just the general concern in the South that that if slaves were allowed to worship on their own, there might be messages communicated that were antagonistic to or subversive of slave society.
Okay, and like talking about running away or something.
Yeah, running away, armed resistance, right? Anything like that, you know. And so there were even laws in some of those states where it would be illegal for slaves to meet, and even in the worship service, by themselves, without some sort of white presence there.
Wow. Okay.
So it's more integration, but it's not like they're not truly integrated, right? But yeah, there was probably more of a presence of mixed race congregations prior to the Civil War than after. But again, you know, you still see those in places after the Civil War.
Okay.
You also see after the Civil War quite a few traveling evangelists who supported themselves. 30 congregations in Kentucky, for example, were started after the war this way. The evangelists would receive room and board from their hosts, right, the people that were as they were traveling, but often there would be a love offering afterwards, where there would be kind of a collection done where people could give some money to support this or help defray some of the expenses of the evangelists, but most of them will get maybe $1 or $2 at most. So they're not making a living, going around preaching and starting congregations. It appears that a lot of activity took place in North Carolina. So there was a lot of work evangelizing in North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, and others, some of which had some active support by whites trying to encourage missionary efforts. Plus, at the same time, other denominations are also becoming very successful. Catholics as well are being very successful in their evangelizing of African Americans. So that probably spurred people on to be more active. By 1876, there were black congregations throughout the South and the Midwest, and the total membership was around 20,000 African Americans. So again, it's beginning to grow in that post-Civil War period, but nowhere near what the membership was prior to. Let's just briefly introduce you to a couple of prominent evangelists during this time, certainly not the only ones. One of them was Alexander Campbell. No, this is a different one. So he's an African American whose name is Alexander Campbell, and he's an evangelist. Different than the Alexander Campbell that he's dead at this point, right? Campbell died shortly after the Civil War. So this Alexander Campbell was born in 1866, the year that the other Alexander Campbell died. Was very active in Tennessee. He was baptized by a man named D.M. Keble, who is the uncle of Marshall Keble, who we will talk about in the 20th century. A very successful African American Keble. D.M. Keble. He appears to have been the first African American to withdraw from a congregation over the medicine. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I had to go.
It's like the Dalai Lama. There must always be an Alexander Campbell to lead the congregation. So when all this divisiveness happens, he appears to have been the first African American to say, I need to leave these churches that are bringing in instruments.
This is Campbell.
Yes, this Campbell.
This Campbell. Black Campbell.
Yes. Black Campbell. There you go. Sometimes he's referred to as Alex Campbell, as a way to kind of distinguish. So he's in this worship service, and here's this preacher going on about how instrumental music is appropriate. And so this Alexander Campbell gets up to kind of oppose this position, and evidently somebody tells the organist to drown him out. Right? So he's up there trying to speak, and the organist is playing really, really loudly, so his opposition against the organ can't be heard. And so he says, I'm leaving. And so he begins a church in his house. And eventually, other leaders join him, other African American leaders join him, and they eventually grow into another congregation. But he's one of these individuals who believes separation needs to take place. Campbell was more on the conservative side. One individual that ends up more on the disciple side was Preston Taylor. Taylor was born in slavery in Louisiana, eventually migrates to Kentucky, where he does achieve freedom and becomes a drummer in the Union Army. And after emancipation, works in a variety of positions with some railroad companies, but also begins preaching as well. He preaches for the Christian church in Mount Sterling, Kentucky. He will eventually move to Nashville, where he will start a funeral company, as well as a park which was open to African Americans for recreation. You know, a lot of the area, of course, that whole separate thing going on in the South, but here was a place where blacks could go for recreation and park and those kind of things. He stays on the Disciples of Christ side through the split. He helped start the National Christian Missionary Convention, which was focused on uniting black disciples to engage in mission work. So it's kind of a sub-unit within the larger National Missionary Society, but focused predominantly on black disciples and African American activity. He will also help start what is today Tennessee State University, all while continuing to be an evangelist. So he's still preaching through all of this as well, sometimes as a located minister, sometimes just as a traveling evangelist. Also during this time, you see the development of several educational institutions focused on education of African Americans. Some of those started by whites that were focused on educating African Americans. Some of them started by African American leaders. And so you have, both groups are kind of interested in education. Schools pop up in Alabama, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Virginia. Most of the time, though, these schools have a lot of good plans, but they never come to fruition. Or if they get started, they last 10 years at most. Right? So a lot of the schools that were mostly focused on education of African Americans don't really get off the ground. Some of them, though, do. Jarvis Christian College, which is still around today, was a disciple school, or is a disciple school in Texas. So it's one of those that has lasted for this 100+ years. It's Jarvis Christian College. Who started that? I don't know. I don't have that down.
And that's in Tennessee.
Texas.
Oh, Texas.
On one hand, you have the concern for education. Then, of course, there's the other concern of evangelism and missions. For some whites particularly, the idea was that by evangelizing African Americans, that might turn into those conversions those people converted becoming missionaries to Africa. And so there's not just a local concern, there's a global concern as well. This concern for missions, however, leads to furthering some of the sectional tensions, because there was a lot of interest in the North of sending missionaries from the North to evangelize African Americans in the South. And a lot of Southerners, some of those in the movement and some outside the movement, did not like how much they felt the Northerners were interfering with life in the South. Right? So even though they're going there for missionary work, there's still a concern that that they're coming here to agitate. And so there was a lot of opposition from Southerners, and especially Southern Christians, of Northern ministers, feeling that they were coming down, not just evangelizing African Americans, but encouraging them to upset society. So one connected with this idea of evangelism and missions was also the concern for educating black preachers, believing that that was what was needed for success among African Americans. That white people, white preachers wouldn't necessarily have the same kind of success. However, institutional support of African American missions began to taper off in the 1870s. The American Christian Missionary Society, some other smaller societies, had been somewhat successful in raising funds in the few years after the war to support missionary work among African Americans, both by whites and by blacks. But the further in history we got from the Civil War, the less there was interest to financially support that. And so people turned to other things like temperance that they were concerned about putting their effort in, putting their money towards. With the fact that there were very few numbers of converts among African Americans in those early years after the Civil War, convinced people that such a work was not possible. And again, it's probably, there's probably some racist notions here. People might not even be totally aware of it, but it's probably like, well, we're not even having success anyway, and so it's not even worth it, right? Because I knew that such and such was going to happen, right? And so, plus there's this resistance from the South about these Northerners coming down to instigate, and that evangelism in the South should be a Southern issue. Right? And so that's part of the reason why you see this kind of decline in white concern about this issue, while, of course, a lot of African American Christians are still very concerned about evangelizing. Another issue, of course, was this continuing one about integration or segregation. Should we work for separate congregations? Should we work for integrated congregations? Some supported the segregation of races in churches. I'm sure that is no surprise to anybody. Some people would say even through the 20th century, and there may even be some truth to it today, that 11 o'clock on Sunday is the most segregated hour in the week. That this separation that even in the North, there is, hey, it's great, you're free, but if you stay over there in that church building, we'll stay over in this church building. So there were a lot of people that had that point. Other people, though, said, no, churches need to be integrated. David Lipscomb was probably one of the ones in the South who advocated the most for integrated congregations, integrated churches. David Lipscomb. Okay. Not somebody you would think, right? Conservative Southerner, right? Against a lot of things. But no, he felt integration was something that was very appropriate. He was very outspoken in his support for the rights of African Americans, and even religious rights. Now, he wasn't perfect, right? And we'll talk a minute here about some segregation attitudes he did have, but he did believe in African American rights. In his meetings, he would make sure to try and take the opportunity to be speaking to black audiences as well. He encouraged every Southern church he came in contact with, either through his meetings or in the Gospel Advocate, which was widely read, that the Southern church needed to make room for blacks to be there, and that Southern Christians should be encouraging faithful attendance at worship. And he would attack. He was fierce in attacking those congregations that did not reach out to evangelize African Americans, or put any sort of stumbling block in their way. And so, this is a quote from him. So our treatment of the Negro, his term, at best, is that of criminal indifference and neglect. To discourage and repel him when, despite that cruel neglect on our part, he seeks membership in the Church of God, is an outrage that ought not for a moment be tolerated. The church was established to help the lowly, the fallen, the outcast, and the degraded. Furthermore, he believed that race prejudice should not exist among Southerners, especially Southerners who he called, quote, gentle blood, refined feeling, cultured hearts, or educated minds. Any sort of segregation or prejudice was prominent only among the, and this is his quote again, the unrefined, narrow-minded, low-born, and ill-bred. And so he was very supportive of the idea of, churches should be made up of black and white members. Lipscomb.
Right.
On the other hand, get the full picture, he did promote the idea that blacks should use a separate entrance.
Oh,
right.
So,
it's
talked about, bro.
Right? It's like, okay, that's really good, but how do you hold those two things, right? Now, it might have been that he supported that as more of a concession rather than a true opinion. But you're undercutting everything else. I mean, it's just, some of those quotes are great about here are African Americans who are wanting to hear about the gospel, despite how whites have treated them and pushed them away. It's criminal to not be preaching to them and to not, and so, but that does shape a lot of ways. And okay, that's great, but it's the same thing with Thomas Jefferson, right? All men are created equal, except for these people I'm holding in bondage. Does undercut it a little bit, but yeah, I think it does kind of show a little bit of the split mind that a lot of white Christians had. They recognize, Lipscomb, of course, in the South, but even in the North, recognizing, this idea of, well, Scripture talks about unity or equality. It talks about there being no difference. But sit in this section, come in through this door.
So it's no different from white and colored section.
That's exactly the same. That's the kind of stuff that was going on. Just like there's white and colored or water fountains in the 20th century. White entrance, black entrance. So there's a lot of racist opinions here. Even though you'd like to not see that among Christians. Obviously it is. There were even people concerned about using the same. A lot of churches use the same communion wine container, and so people had concerns about drinking after somebody. It's like, really, using the building at the same time. So often people would, it's like, okay, we're part of the same church, but the whites meet at this time, and then the blacks meet at this time, right? So you're not even using the building at the same time in the same congregation. Concerns about integrated Sunday schools. What's it going to mean if the black children and white children are together in the same Sunday school? Right? So there's a lot of this kind of thing.
Wow, and those were really hair-raising issues for them back then, wasn't it?
And again, you have some people that are pushing for integration, but then there are a lot of people that are very concerned about what that would mean. Well, that would mean we're Christians, right? But not surprisingly, because of some of that, there were a lot of black preachers, a lot of African Americans who preferred separate congregations. I think you can see why. Plus, that the feeling that, well, it's not just a feeling, it was true, of the way in which whites were trying to make sure everything was done their way, and so they didn't like white interference in their worship and organization. And so they just kind of wanted, let us go off and worship and not have to worry about those kind of issues. We'll pick up on Thursday, talk a little bit more about some things, get into the 20th century. We'll also talk more about how some African American preachers began to address these racial issues, right? So they're not just focused on evangelizing, but also addressing some of the racial issues that are becoming much more prominent with emancipation. So we'll pick that up on Thursday.